Adolf Hitler is one of history's most infamous figures, a name synonymous with war, destruction, and genocide. But in today's digital age, social media platforms, especially Instagram, have given rise to a disturbing trend: people idolizing Hitler for reasons that distort historical reality. Some claim he was a brilliant strategist. Others highlight his so-called kindness towards animals. Some even suggest he had progressive views on race. But how much of this is true? And how much is misinformation? Today we break down the real history of Adolf Hitler, his rise and fall, and the myths that have taken on a life of their own. Born in 1889 in Austria, young Adolf Hitler had aspirations of becoming an artist. Twice rejected from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, he struggled with poverty and resentment, living in homeless shelters before moving to Germany. His political awakening began after serving in World War I, where he was wounded and temporarily blinded by a gas attack. But rather than pursuing a normal civilian life, he embraced radical nationalism. By the early 1920s, Hitler had joined the German Workers' Party, later transforming it into the Nazi Party. He positioned himself as a charismatic orator, capitalizing on Germany's economic collapse and the anger surrounding the Treaty of Versailles. He blamed Jews, communists, and foreign powers for Germany's problems, using propaganda to turn frustration into action. His failed coup attempt in 1923, known as the Beer Hall Putsch, landed him in prison. But instead of fading into obscurity, Hitler used his time behind bars to write Mein Kampf, laying out his racist ideology and vision for Germany's future. By 1933, he had successfully manipulated the system to become Chancellor of Germany, consolidating power and establishing a dictatorship. One of the most common misconceptions is that Hitler was an unmatched military genius. While his early war strategies, such as the Blitzkrieg, were effective, many of his later decisions were disastrous and driven by arrogance rather than tactical brilliance. Initially, Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939 triggered World War II. Hitler's rapid victories over France and the Low Countries made him appear unstoppable, but his overconfidence led to crucial mistakes, such as opening a two-front war by invading the Soviet Union. The harsh Russian winter, coupled with the resilience of the Red Army, turned the tide against Germany. Another blunder? Declaring war on the United States in 1941 after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, dragging Germany into a conflict it could not sustain. By 1944, the Allies had landed in Normandy, pushing German forces back. Hitler's insistence on rigid tactics, his refusal to listen to his generals, and his obsession with holding territory at all costs accelerated Nazi Germany's downfall. By April 1945, Berlin was under siege. The once powerful Nazi regime was in ruins, and Hitler's closest allies were either dead, captured, or deserting him. The Red Army was closing in, advancing street by street, while Allied forces pressed from the west. The once mighty Third Reich was now reduced to rubble, its days numbered. Knowing that capture was imminent and unwilling to face the humiliation of surrender, Hitler retreated to his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Here, in the dimly lit corridors of what would become his tomb, he surrounded himself with the last remnants of his loyalists. Despite the clear reality of Germany's defeat, he continued to issue orders to divisions that no longer existed, clinging to the delusion of a miraculous turnaround.
On April 2029, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in Abriefendsommerzeremonie.
The following day, April 30th, they both took their own lives, Hitler by gunshot, Braun by cyanide. Their bodies were hastily burned by their attendants as Soviet troops closed in on the bunker. Hours later, Berlin fell, marking the definitive end of the Third Reich. But while Hitler's physical existence ended that day, the myths, distortions, and dangerous legacies surrounding him would persist for decades. The ruins of Berlin bore witness to the catastrophic consequences of his leadership, yet in the years to come, revisionist narratives, misinformation, and selective storytelling would attempt to reshape history. In the era of social media, misinformation spreads faster than ever. On platforms like Instagram and TikTok, some individuals have misrepresented Hitler as a misunderstood leader rather than a dictator responsible for millions of deaths. The biggest misconceptions? Hitler was kind to animals. Yes, Nazi Germany passed animal welfare laws. But this did not come from compassion. it was part of an image-building strategy. Hitler himself was a vegetarian not out of love for animals, but due to health issues and personal preferences. He wasn't racist. He admired non-European cultures.
This is false.
Hitler's ideology was built on racial hierarchy. He viewed many non-European peoples as inferior and planned to expand Nazi influence globally. He was a military genius. While an effective propagandist, Hitler's military decisions, especially later in the war, were impulsive and led to catastrophic defeats for Germany. The Nazis created a strong, unified Germany. The truth is, Hitler's policies led to the destruction of Germany, millions of deaths, and suffering that lasted for generations. Romanticizing historical figures without critical analysis is dangerous. When people idolize Hitler based on selective or false information, they risk distorting history and undermining the reality of his atrocities. The Holocaust, the brutal war, and the suffering he inflicted cannot be ignored. Misinformation can manipulate public perception, shaping narratives that downplay or justify the actions of dangerous leaders. This is why historical literacy is essential. Understanding history means studying it in full, not just cherry-picking aspects that fit a narrative. Social media should be a tool for learning, not for spreading dangerous myths. Adolf Hitler was not a misunderstood hero. He was a dictator whose ideology led to global war, genocide, and devastation. Any attempt to paint him as a figure of inspiration must be met with historical truth and critical thinking. As consumers of digital content, we must question what we see, fact-check sources, and ensure that history is remembered for what it truly was, not as a distorted version that fits an agenda. If you found this video insightful, consider subscribing for more content that uncovers the truth behind history and modern-day narratives. This is We Think, where we challenge misinformation and seek the facts.